Yeah, the other thing I would say about a flywheel is, like, there is somewhat of an order to the things, and they don't always work in that order, but the problem, I think, with a lot of people, take like a pastor that's listening to this, everybody's going to, for the most part, agree on the categories, like if you're married, you understand Ephesians 5, like you need to love your wife, you need to sacrifice for your wife, you need to serve her. You understand if you're a parent, like you need to train your children. But sometimes we don't really know like what order to put those things in. And like we there's not a great plan to be like, man, I only got so much energy, I only got so many hours. How do I think about this stuff? And this is where I would say just this idea of flywheel and thinking about health, it's they're biblical concepts, but some of it's just like, man, best practice just for like the way people think. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
All right. Hey, guys. Welcome back to the Breaking Barriers podcast. My name is Pastor Andrew Hopper. I'm here today with Pastor Bobby Harrington, and we're going to be tackling a very important topic today of how our church's health will never outrun our own health. And that health is actually broken up into a couple of different categories. We tend to think about health, I think, in the church in primarily spiritual terms, and it certainly is that. We need to have, healthy souls, and the heart is the wellspring of life, and all that kind of stuff. I get it. But, the Bible talks about us as being incredibly holistic people that God breathed into the dust. And there's just these different parts of our life that are very real buckets that need intentionality in terms of focusing on them if they're going to be healthy. Mm-hmm. One of the things we say a lot is passivity is never the pathway to health. Health is always going to come from an intentional focus on it. What we measure grows, and we want to measure different things in our life and kind of these different buckets that we're going to get into today in order to see those things grow. Because as I said, and Bobby, you can jump into this, our churches are never going to outrun our spiritual health. I mean, our health. They may do so for a while, just like the example I've used, like a bodybuilder, or somebody working out for sports, they can get on steroids and they can shoot their maxes through the roof for a while, and they can play outside the boundaries for a little while. Eventually that stuff's going to come home to roost. And sadly, we see that in our day a lot, with pastors and stuff. So that idea of just our health being directly kind of in proportion, or maybe you could say in some ways our health in different areas is the lid of what our church and our leadership, our leadership is going to be able to show up in the evidence of our church growing. What do you think about that? How does that hit you right off the bat?
Yeah, so I kind of have two thoughts about just kind of the concept. When you think about, I think a lot of times people have a real simplistic view of this kind of topic that we're talking about, like personal, spiritual, physical, emotional, your family's healthy. A lot of times it's kind of like, man, as long as you rest enough, like you're going to be fine in ministry, mm-hmm. And like you're going to be healthy. And obviously, like there's a lot of stats about, people burning out in ministry, mm-hmm. people struggling, having like an emotional crisis in ministry, maybe somebody's family is kind of blowing up in ministry, something's going bad, right? Somebody's marriage, gets kind of derailed. A lot of times we think, well, and there's a lot of books out there like this, like, man, as long as you're resting enough, then like all that stuff's going to be fine. And obviously, when you're talking about health, I would say rest is like definitely one of the most important components. I mean, right? It's baked into the Bible. It's baked into the first 3 chapters of Genesis. Like you can't work without rest, and you got to work from rest. And like, there's just that pattern that's built into the entire Bible. But what we're going to get into today is it is more than that though, mm-hmm. like it's thinking strategically about, loving God with your heart, mind, soul, your strength. Mm-hmm. You have a wife, you have kids, you have the responsibilities of the church. And I think another reality is if your church is going to grow, and it's like this in any area of life, right? Sports, leadership, business. If your church is going to grow, the weight of things that are going to be on your shoulders that you're going to have to be healthy enough to mm-hmm. bear, that is probably going to also increase over time. Mm-hmm. And, that's probably part of the reason why there is some level of like, burnout and stuff in churches, because it's not just like this static, well, as long as I'm healthy. It's like, well, you got to be healthy enough to kind of like weather the load of what's happening at your church and what's happening in your life. So I think it's an important topic that probably in ministry people don't talk about enough.
Yeah, I think that a lot of guys maybe have a big vision for their church, but do they have that same type of vision for their family? And some people it's like, yeah, I do. But then it's like, well, do you have that same type of vision for your own physical health, your own spiritual health?
Mm-hmm.
And certainly what we want to get into today a little bit is also talking about the financial picture of a pastor's life, and what I would argue is that we need to, and again, this is not, I love about our podcast, it's not size specific, it's growth orientation specific. Okay. So, I think a church of 1,000 that has no aspirations of growing is going to get less out of this podcast than a church of 50 that wants to double in the next 2 or 3 years. Right. If you want to, grow, in the church world, what we're going to say is, hey, that has got to be accompanied by growth in your personal, spiritual, health, your fitness, your financial life. That if you're not growing as a person, if you're not growing in the Lord in all these different areas of your life that the Bible talks about, just in a holistic Christian wise life, then the idea of your church growing is going to be it's almost just going to be a little bit of it's going to be so siloed that I think that the integration of your personal life is going to end up the lack of growth in your personal life is going to end up bleeding in, and it's going to end up catching up. Now, one of the things that we're going to talk about today is these different categories, and I'll talk about mine, you talk about yours, and then I want to talk about stages and how things can change over time. But for me, I've really tried to organize my life around, and I've had different iterations of this for years and years, but what I've kind of landed on is thinking about fitness, family, flock, and finance. And they're fine. They're 4 F's. They make kind of sense or whatever. But I think really for anybody in ministry, these things are kind of encompassing the categories that you need to at least think about. Now, people might split them up. I know you're going to split them up a different way, but the idea of fitness, spiritual, physical health, the idea of family, I actually think about friendships and just that relational part of your life, what God's given you there. Obviously the flock. So if somebody's listening to this, I know we have business people that listen to this and they're not part of they're not leading a church. It's like, well, okay, whatever that is, that's your job, that's your business. It's kind of your vocation. God created you to be a worker. When God created the world, he had dirt under his fingernails. We're going to have dirt under our fingernails. So there's a big part of our life that is work related. And then the financial picture, of just, I think people can think, hey, I didn't get into ministry to make a lot of money. And it's like, well, that's true. None of us got into ministry to make a lot of money. And if you did, I don't know, unless you're part of some crazy.
I'd say a lot of pastors, in my experience, I've heard this, even from really large churches. Pastors will get out of ministry because of financial stress, though. I find that when I'm around a group of pastors, even if it's like larger churches, and I begin talking about like, financial security or stuff like that, like people seem to, for whatever reason, I think a lot of people in ministry don't think super well around.
Well, I think, we could just double click on that for a minute. I agree, but I think part of what it is a conflict of interest and conflict of motivation. You're trying to figure out, man, I got into ministry. I didn't do this to make money, but it's almost like we take on a bit of a poverty ethic then of like, I'm supposed to be poor my entire life.
Right.
And I think there's another way to view it, which we're probably going to get into in this podcast, which is, no, we should of all people care about stewarding our resources as well as anybody else, maybe better, because maybe being in ministry, they're going to be more limited. You better be more shrewd with what you have. And so we're going to talk about some of that stuff. So I've broken it into 4 F's, again, fitness, family, flock, finance. I know you think about it in a different way. I'd love to hear your kind of flywheel here, and we'll get into even flywheel concept here in a minute.
Yeah, let's just talk about the kind of flywheel concept.
All right, go for it.
Thinking about a flywheel, the concept of like applying it to like business or using it as like a thinking concept comes from Jim Collins' book, From Good to Great, like in the early 2000s. And the idea is like, if you think about like a big, super heavy, multi-1,000-pound, like mechanical, like flywheel that the idea is over time, if, you're pushing that thing in a big circle and that thing is spinning, it weighs so much over time. What happens is it'll begin to pick up momentum, or it'll begin to pick up energy, and over time it's easier to spin it again. You know what I mean? Like it requires however many, 1,000 pounds of force to get it started and to begin to spin it. But as it begins to spin, because it's so heavy, it kind of comes with this like momentum the next time around, right? So Jim Collins used this in his book Good to Great to talk about like really good organizations. He wasn't just talking about for-profit businesses, but really good organizations. They build what they're doing around the concept of a flywheel. So they identify the right actions that build momentum, and that's kind of the key, really. Because you have tons of businesses that are really successful and don't ultimately make it, and you have other businesses that are successful for a long period of time. And he said the really great organizations, they've identified what those 4 or 5 key areas of like momentum are, and they have figured out, hey, in our model of what we're trying to do, so we're talking about personal health.
Right.
In our model of what we're trying to do, here's where this whole thing starts, and here's how each part, so for you said 4 parts. For me, I think about 5 parts, but it's all the same stuff. Here's how each part leads to the next, and here's how I can invest my energy, time, money into the flywheel. Instead of what happens with a lot of people, personally or in an organization, sometimes they don't, using business terms, they don't reinvest the profits back into the flywheel. Right. So like somebody that struggles financially, you could see this real clearly, right? Like they use all of their money and they spend it without investing any of it back into making more money, saving money, compounding money. And so it's like they're always starting from zero. They're always starting from scratch. And when we're thinking about designing our life like a flywheel, we're trying to think about like, okay, how do I over time become, more healthy in terms of like my marriage and my kids and spiritual health and my leadership. Now, obviously there's things that happen in life, right? Like, man, there's tragedy, we get sick. So it's not like we're in like control of all of this, but the Bible's, it's very much a biblical concept too, because the Bible talks about like sowing and reaping. That's the idea, right? Like, man, life is not totally random, right? It's like what we sow most of the time is what we're going to reap. And so if we think about these things the right way, I mean, in many ways, it's what the book of Proverbs is. Hey, pull these levers.
Yeah, I mean, the proverb says the one who works the fig tree is the one who eats its fruit. You tend to the tree, you eat the fruit. I think what you're saying is very important, and I think just an example of that would be in our church, we have a flywheel, right, for growth. And one of the things that drives me nuts about where we are just in terms of church society, growth society, is the thing that people many times want to attack about church growth movement is the idea of trying to reinvest the profits into the thing. What I mean by that is, think about it, okay?
Right.
Gather, group, give, go. That's our flywheel. You gather huge groups of people in weekend gatherings, and then you put them in groups. In group, they're learning how to give themselves away, time, talent, and treasure, give. And then finally, you're at go, and a huge part of go is what? Inviter evangelism. Most people come to faith by somebody saying to them, hey, I want you to come, like the Samaritan woman, I want you to come see a man who told me everything I ever did. I want you to come see something that changed my life. I bring you to church, bring you to an evangelistic crusade, bring you to a small group on campus. That's most people end up coming to Christ that way. And whenever we sort of attack that part and we're like, well, inviter evangelism is not real evangelism or whatever, you're just sort of undercutting in some big ways the concept of what can continue to create the momentum. And so I think that, what you're saying is it just feels like it's a true kind of principle in life, whether you're building a business, a church, or you're trying to build your own life.
Yeah. The other thing I would say about a flywheel is like, there is somewhat of an order to the things, and they don't always work in that order, but the problem I think with a lot of people, take like a pastor that's listening to this, everybody's going to, for the most part, agree on the categories, like if you're married, you understand Ephesians 5, like you need to love your wife, you need to sacrifice for your wife, you need to serve her. You understand if you're a parent, like you need to train your children, but sometimes we don't really know like what order to put those things in. And like, we there's not a great plan to be like, man, I only got so much energy, I only got so many hours. How do I think about this stuff? And this is where I would say just this idea of flywheel and thinking about health, it's, they're biblical concepts, but some of it's just like, man, best practice just for like the way people think, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the way to like, we're able to track some of this stuff more than we were 1,000 years ago. People obviously live longer now. So there is something real that's to that. So they're biblical concepts, but just thinking about, man, how do I relate all these things to one another?
Yeah. So I want to get into, the different ways that we can think about what those buckets are. But I do think we want to just continue on this flywheel concept for a second, because if there's any magic, I think, in what we've tried to land on and what we try to teach our staff, it is sort of in the idea of reinvesting the profits, if you want to call it that, into the thing that makes the whole flywheel go. Because a lot of people, I think, just view it as like, man, I got 5 buckets in my life that need attention, Right. And sadly, I think for pastors, like if you're looking at the buckets and you're like, okay, the bucket is like quiet time, spiritual health, physical health, my kids, my family, my financial picture, and my church. Let's say those are the ones. Sadly, I think many times what we do is we just put like all the weight in like the spiritual bucket, and maybe then after that it's all the weight in our church, or maybe it's all the weight in our church and none of
right.
And we're like, man, some of them are really full, some of them are kind of empty. And I think what we're trying to advocate for is like, no, the momentum that goes into one spills over and fills the next bucket, spills over, fills the next bucket, spills over, fills the next bucket. And if you think about it the right way, when you get to the very end of the flywheel, you need to have some mechanism where it ends up kind of pushing back into the first one. So I'll just give you mine. Then we can talk about how you think about it. But like for me, I think sometimes when I do teaching on this, like I've some of our business leaders at our church, I've done teachings with our church planners and with our staff on this. I think it catches people a little bit off guard that the first thing that I talk about is fitness. Because that doesn't feel right? Like it feels like if you were thinking about buckets, your family should be ahead of your fitness, and your flock should be ahead of your fitness, right? And what I would say is like, man, those things are, I think, more important than fitness in terms of just, if you just ask my heart level aspiration of like, man, do I want my kids to be healthy or do I want to be healthy? I'd say my kids. Same way with the flock. Like, man, I feel like God's called me to be a pastor, and man, there's almost nothing more important to me than trying to be a good pastor and have a good flock. But that's not where the flywheel starts. Just because it gets, is the thing that is first in priority doesn't mean it's the thing that's the most important. I think about one analogy I use for that is like, man, if I said, hey, what's the most important thing in your life? People will say, we do that as preachers. We're like, hey, we'll just go look at your bank account, Well, my house costs more than anything else in my life. But I wouldn't say it's the most important thing. It does cost the most if you look at my, just my monthly income statement, but I wouldn't say it's like the most important thing in my life. My point is, some things take an inordinate amount of energy that doesn't make them de facto more important than something else, right? And so for me, I think about fitness, spiritual and physical, and we'll talk about these categories. We'll actually get into what we're doing on these things and hopefully give some thought-provoking questions. But then I think, man, the way the flywheel works is, if I'm physically and spiritually healthy, it gives me the margin to be able to be a good dad and a good husband. And if my home is sort of rocking and rolling, it's like, man, my wife feels supported. She feels like I have put her first, above the kids, above myself. She's healthy. She has margin. If the kids are doing well in terms of, man, their friendships are doing well, they're whatever, they're knocking out their sports, school. I mean, they're thriving, right? If all that's buttoned up, then I have the space that I need to be a good pastor. And from the base of strength from my family, I can overflow into being a pastor in our church flock. This is what I'm talking about. Man, if our church is doing well and our leadership team is good, and man, there's not a million fires I'm having to put out because we've set things up the right way and people are being discipled, and there's a general up and to the right kind of movement in our church, like that gives me the opportunity to have more financial freedom. Not just for making more money because your church gets bigger, but also because, man, you end up having mental space to do some other stuff. Maybe you're a writer, or maybe you do real estate, or maybe you're doing, maybe you have something, a side hustle or whatever. Like, if things are rocking and rolling and you feel like you have good margin and energy, it gives you the space to maybe want to do something else. But then the big thing is, okay, when you get to the end of that flywheel with finance, what do you do with that? And what I would say is if there's anything proprietary to what we're talking about in my life, it's, man, you try to take a lot of that margin and you try to pour it back into whatever is going to make you healthy in terms of fitness, right? So it goes all the way back around. So maybe that's a hobby. Maybe that's making sure if your wife loves CrossFit that you make sure there's margin enough to do CrossFit, maybe it's thinking about a spiritual retreat once a year. Well, I don't know what it would be, but it's like you're taking that margin and you're putting it back into the flywheel itself rather than just allowing it to, go into nothing that's not actually going to help move that thing right back around again so that you can be a healthier version of you.
Right. Yeah, let me just walk through mine because it's saying the same thing that you're saying, but it's just I think about it a little differently, but the concepts are the same. And I think this is what people got to figure out for their life, what motivates them and what motivates kind of their heart and their soul when they think about it, So for me, when I think about category number one, it's just the idea of man, you're going to be the best version of yourself to everybody that's around you when you take care of yourself first. For me, I like to work out. It never is a chore for me. I mean, if I could just work out all day instead of work, I probably would do that. So for me, I really try to put that in the category of love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And for me, that kind of incorporates it all. If I'm going to miss something a lot of times, I'm probably going to miss reading my Bible versus miss working out. So I try to make sure to just have that emphasis on okay, I got to keep in the forefront. I got to be dealing with my own spiritual health first and my relationship with God and prayer and getting the word in my heart. I got to be physically healthy, what you're talking about. And that's the way that you eat. That's working out. That's trying to have some sort of cardio fitness. And I mean, we hear stories all the time of pastors having heart attacks and having a stroke. And then it's honestly, it's emotional and mental health, that if I have stuff going on in my mind with relationships that I'm in, that I'm willing to kind of be truthful in those relationships and deal with that stuff, because it can kind of get in your mind, get in your heart. So it's man, you gotta, on the airplane, right? You gotta if there's an issue, you gotta put on your own oxygen mask before you try to help somebody else. That's the concept of number one. Number two, I like to think of splitting, serving my wife and the kids, just because it just has helped me kind of mentally to not just throw it in the same box. And I found myself in the rut of almost going around my wife to try to help the kids and just assume she was doing fine, almost man, we're just kind of, I don't know what you would use, but man, she's fine. I'm fine. Let's go help the kids. And I've just had to realize okay, no, I need to figure out what does she need from me? How does Ephesians 5, yes, I'm trying to make her more holy. I'm trying to serve her. I'm trying to sacrifice for her, but I have to understand what that is. You know what I mean? What are those sacrifices she needs? How does she need me to serve her? Does she, some of the gifts that I use here at the church to help the church get ahead, man, how can I help? How can I use some of those gifts in her life to try to help her? And then, when she's most healthy and our relationship is most healthy, I mean, anybody that has kids, probably most people, a lot of people listening to this have kids. Man, when we're a team and we're more healthy together, man, parenting kids is a team sport sometimes, and it's man, I mean, just for the single parents and stuff out there, man, what a hard, thing to try to do it by yourself. Having somebody next to you, if you got 3 kids or 4 kids or 5 kids, and you guys being aligned and on the same page, it just really truly does flow into. Because man, if there's an issue with spouses, and then you're trying to parent, man, that's not good.
Right.
Parents aren't on the same page. They don't have the same vision. So for me, the third one is man, from Proverbs, train a child in the way they should go. That's kind of our goal, right? Man, we're trying to teach them everything, right? We're trying to teach them about spirituality. We're trying to teach them how to have manners, the type of life that we want them to live, what's the culture of our family. And man, when that is all kind of dialed in, the way that I think about it is man, that's when you could be your best self out in the world. Because all pastors have dealt with this, right? You got some fire, you got some dumpster fire at home and you're at church, and anybody that has a normal job has dealt with this, right? You're trying to be at work and you got some fire at home. It's very hard to be your best self out in the world if there's a rift with you and your wife, or there's a major issue going on with one of your kids. And it's not that having like a strategic flywheel like prevents that stuff, but it at least allows for you to put out your best effort and for you to pray for what you want God to do in your life. So for me, number 4 is like, I would put the flock one and just like serve the world. Like my service to the world, as soon as I leave my house, if that thing is healthy, my relationship with God is healthy, I'm physically healthy, now I can be my best self to serve the church. We both work at Mercy Hill, to serve the church, to serve any friendships that I'm in, and then to serve extended family. Mm-hmm. And, you know, like, man, I'm only going to be able to give my best self to those areas when I'm healthy, my wife's healthy, my kids are healthy. And then number 5, it's like, man, making money in the world is basically just, man, how, you know, for the most part, how much value you bring to the world is how much money you make in return. I know it's not that simple, but you think about people in the world that solve the biggest problems, those people most of the time make the most amount of money. So it's like, I like to think of category 5 as rest and invest is the way I like to think about category 5. Then they're kind of the same thing to me. Like the Bible tells us, man, don't spend all your money. Like you need to keep some aside, right? Don't spend all your energy.
Fool devours all they have.
Right.
Yeah.
Don't spend all your energy. Like God tells us, man, you work 6 days and you take 1 off. We probably have energy to work 7 days, but God's like, don't do that. You got to keep margin, right? The idea of like rest and invest for me is like, man, you could run 7 days a week, right? You could spend all the money that you have, but we got to have a plan for the future. Like we got to have a financial plan for the future. Like, man, there's new problems next week at work. There's new problems at home next week. So like if I spend every single bit of my energy,
right,
you know, so for me, that's the, you know, just like, man, what do I keep left over? And then like you said, and this is probably maybe the most proprietary, like, man, when you're just thinking about it, this is maybe unique to this conversation. Like start making a list. Okay, Andrew, like if I give you $10,000 just randomly, here you go. Hey man, here's $10,000. What would be all the ideas that you'd have? Like, how could you invest that in your spiritual health? How could you invest it in your physical health? How could you invest it in your kids? How can you invest it in your wife? And money's not the only like resource we're reinvesting, right? Because we're reinvesting energy, we're reinvesting time. But it's good to just, because a lot of people are like, I don't even know, I wouldn't even know.
Yeah.
Like, you know, where to invest any of that stuff.
Right. Yeah, and potentially where they would invest it would not move the needle in their actual life flywheel. It could just like fly away into nothing.
Right.
Like it made no impact, you know.
Right.
And you know, 2 years from now, you never would have even known it was there.
Right.
So that's what we're trying to guard against. Okay, man, that's great. Now, one thing I think is good for us to say is like, we're not advocating that people do it the same way we're doing it. But I'm advocating for like, man, if you're pastoring, leading a church that you want to see grow, you better not have the vision for that church be bigger than the vision you have for these different areas of your life. You know, because man, I have never in my life one time met a guy who was like, man, casting this big vision for his church, and it was actually growing and getting it. You know, that when you started talking to them, whether they did what I'm talking about or they were just an alien and did it intuitively, they also had big vision for other areas of their life. And some kind of way, the church, you know, if they were healthy. Now, like I said, guys shoot steroids all the time, and they end up with like, you could end up with a big church where when you get behind it, something breaks. The marriage broke, their health broke. I'm not talking about those guys. What I'm saying is, man, guys who have growth, longevity, man, it happens over a long time. A lot of times they had a big vision for these other areas of their life. They thought about their money. They thought about their kids. They thought about what they want to do with their health, you know, generally speaking. So, man, for us, we just want to dive into these areas and just try to foment that vision that guys listening to this, whether you're in a church of 50, 500,000, you know, whether you're just starting out, church planner, whatever, like what vision do you have for these different areas of your life? I'm going to just use my categories just because they're right in front of me, and you just kind of chime in with all your stuff too. But as I'm doing that, go ahead.
I would say, this is a good, like, you know, probably part 1, part 2 of this podcast. Like a good analogy, I think, for people that are still trying to wrap their heads around this for exactly what you're saying. We hear this a lot in ministry. So anybody that's in ministry that's listening to this, sometimes we'll say, man, you know, that ministry kind of outpaced that person's character. Right. And what we mean by that is like, man, the growth of that ministry outpaced like where their personal kind of character was at, right? So that's one area of life. What we're talking about is like the potential that the ministry would outpace all these different areas of your life, you know? And so you need a vision for, man, yeah, as your church grows, like, man, the strength of your marriage needs to grow, and the strength of your family unit and your personal health.
Right.
And it's not just, man, how healthy you are spiritually, but it's like, no, like, what's your body fat percentage? You know, like, what are you eating? Are you exercising? And for some reason, a lot of times with pastors, it's like that stuff can just be like totally neglected.
Right.
You know, the Bible speaks to it, and the Bible's like, man, it's not the very most important thing, but it's very important.
Yeah.
You know,
we are whole people. And I think it's true too, that we need to say, you know, none of us can control what the outcome of all this stuff is.
Right.
I mean, you know, like you mentioned, a guy has a heart attack or whatever. And it's like, well, I've known guys that run 10 miles a week and work out and they had a heart attack. It's like, man, they had a genetically predisposed, or they're guys who do every single thing that that we all want to do with our kids, man. They were involved in the church. They took them to mission trips. They read the Bible with them in the morning. The kids reject Christ, you know, and it's like heartbreaking, but it's like, it's not exactly causing, you know, you can't exactly like link up cause and effect with some of this stuff. But what we do get a chance to do, if you move it away from just the effect and what's going to happen down the road, and you actually move it more in the camp of what honors God.
Right.
You know, if you just say, hey, I'm going to do all things to his glory, best that I can, then I think it actually becomes pretty clear some of the things that we need to be doing in these different areas of our life.